In the heart of medieval Europe, where winter was more than just a season, it was an unforgiving trial. A humble black shepherd named Elric Amos stood at the edge of survival. For Elric, the falling snow wasn't something to marvel at. It was a signal, a warning. Another night where life hung by a thread, and even the smallest mistake could mean death. With no knowledge of electricity or modern shelter, no warm brick house to return to, Elric faced the icy dark alone, his breath visible in the frozen air, his fingers stiff from frost, his body wrapped in layers of rough wool and damp sheepskin. While the village behind him rested, nestled in flickering candlelight and warmth, Elric was on the outskirts, watching, listening, enduring. Every howl of the wind was a threat. Every crunch in the snow could be a wolf or worse. His flock, dozens of sheep huddled together in fear, relied solely on him. They were more than animals. They were life itself, food, wool, trade, survival. And Elric, no more than 22, carried the weight of that responsibility with quiet strength. He was not born into wealth or privilege. His father, an old herder named Braxton Amos, had passed down the staff, the knowledge, and the burden. There was no time for dreams or idle talk, just survival. Elric had no sword, no steel armor, only a crooked staff, a flint stone wrapped in leather, and the instincts of a boy raised on hardship. When the sun fell behind the jagged hills, night didn't just bring cold, it brought isolation so deep it echoed in the bones. The stars above, so distant and cold, seemed like indifferent watchers of his struggle. The land turned into a frozen battlefield, and Elric walked it with quiet determination. He scouted for a place to shield the flock from the sharp wind, sometimes beneath the thick arms of pine trees, sometimes near craggy rocks that held just enough warmth to matter. But there were nights when no shelter could be found, when snow and sleet lashed against his back and hunger gnawed at his belly louder than any predator's growl. And still, he stayed. Why did he do it? Because the loss of even one sheep could mean no meat on the table for his mother back in the village. Because if Elric failed, the village weavers would have no wool to spin. Because in a world built on survival, his job was sacred. There were no breaks, no hot meals, no promise of tomorrow, just Elric Amos, a lone sentinel in a white hell, using every ounce of knowledge passed to him through whispers, through scars, through the smoke of a fire that had to last the night. What gave him the strength to continue when the cold became a living thing trying to take his soul? That is where our journey begins, with the story of a shepherd who fought not battles of glory, but wars against the wind, snow, and silence. Elric Amos was not just a boy tending sheep. In the medieval world, a shepherd was the invisible thread, holding the fabric of survival together. Every fleece, every drop of milk, every morsel of meat the village relied on came through the hands of men like him. Yet few ever looked him in the eye. Fewer still understood the weight he carried. The village of Stonehaven, tucked between steep ridges and frostbitten fields, depended on him more than they admitted. Without the flock, the villagers would face hunger, nakedness, and ruin. And yet, Elric slept alone in the hills, his shelter a patch of earth, his company the wind, his reward a nod of approval at the market if wool was clean and the sheep unscarred. He was often mistaken for a wanderer, someone without place. But the truth was that Elric's path was fixed from birth. The son of Braxton Amos, he learned to walk beside animals before he could read. His mother, Nala Amos, once said, "The land raises you before the people do." And that was how Elric lived, shaped by terrain, not tenderness. Each morning began at first light, with a leather pouch of dried berries and cold bread tied to his waist. He would whistle to the dogs, Bran and Cinder, and begin the slow, deliberate process of moving the herd. Some days the sun rose behind mist, and the hills echoed with strange bird calls. Other days the sky remained a sheet of gray, unchanging and cold. He had no home in the way others understood it. No roof that didn't leak, no door to bar the cold. His life was nomadic, always searching for better grazing, always moving before the snow caught up. The lack of permanence carved away at his body and spirit. His legs ached from miles of trudging. His back stiffened from sleeping on frozen soil. But even worse was the silence. Days could pass without a human voice. His conversations were with animals. His thoughts, kept to himself. The wolves didn't just haunt the forests, they crept into the mind. Loneliness, Elric learned, could be deadlier than frostbite. In spite of all this, he never abandoned his flock. Guiding sheep wasn't about brute strength. It was rhythm, tone, and presence. His staff wasn't a weapon. It was an extension of his will. With it, he could nudge a lamb away from danger or hold off a charging dog. His whistle patterns were a language only the animals understood. Short bursts for gathering, long hums for moving forward, sharp calls for danger. Predators weren't just fangs in the dark. Disease could wipe out a flock in days. A fall into a ravine could spell the end for half the herd. Elric had to be more than vigilant. He had to be wise. He learned to read signs in the dirt, to notice a limp in a ewe from 100 paces, to recognize the low hum of coming illness in the bleat of a lamb. Still, his efforts went mostly unnoticed. The villagers saw meat, milk, and wool. They didn't see the sleepless nights, the frozen fingers, or the bruises hidden under woolen sleeves. They didn't see the wolves whose eyes gleamed just beyond the campfire. They didn't know the cold breath of death that hovered just behind Elric as he stood between his flock and the dark. He was their unseen protector, the first to rise and the last to sleep, the one who faced the wild so they could stay tame. And so, the question wasn't why Elric Amos continued. The question was how. How did a young shepherd, abandoned by comfort, stripped of companionship, and surrounded by danger, find the strength to rise each morning and carry the weight of a village on his shoulders? That answer lies deeper, in his preparation, in his resilience, and in the harsh rituals that made him more than just a boy with a staff. Winter in Stonehaven was not a gentle visitor. It came like a curse, coating the land with a white silence that devoured warmth and hope alike. For Elric Amos, it marked the beginning of something few understood, a living war against the elements. No armor, no reinforcements, just him, the Yowie, flock, and a cold that seemed to breathe. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees Celsius. Winds howled like banshees over the hills, cutting through wool and leather as if it were paper. Frost didn't just bite, it consumed. Trees groaned under the weight of snow, the very air turned into a knife. On the worst nights, Elric could hear ice cracking beneath his boots as if the land itself wanted to swallow him. He had no access to firewood stores, no cabins, no hearth waiting. Just a bundle of damp sticks, a stubborn flint, and the knowledge that one failed fire could mean his last breath. His sheepskin cloak stiffened into armor, his gloves frozen at the fingers. Breathing became slow, shallow, too deep in his lungs. Would sting, too fast, and they would freeze. The cold didn't only strike the skin, it attacked the mind. Thoughts turned sluggish. Fatigue crept in like a shadow. But Elric couldn't afford to rest. Not really. If he stopped moving, the cold would steal into his bones. If he slept too long, he might not wake up. He had learned that lesson the hard way. Years ago, when a neighboring boy shepherd fell asleep in a snowbank and never rose again. Hypothermia came quickly, especially with damp clothes. Wet leather boots turned into death traps. The snow soaked everything. If Elric slipped while crossing a stream or was caught in a sudden storm, even a small exposure could cost him a toe or his life. The sheep were no less vulnerable. He had to guide them to natural shelters, beneath fir trees, inside narrow rock crevices, or into tight gullies where the wind softened. When none were available, he built makeshift barriers with sticks and branches, wrapping cloaks over the weakest lambs. Food, too, became war. Grain stores were low, hay was precious. Sometimes he crushed icy roots under his boot and scraped up what herbs he'd dried months ago. What little he had, hard bread, salted fat, dried berries, was shared with his dogs and rationed for days. Hunger didn't ask for permission, it just gnawed. Still, he stayed on watch, eyes scanning the dark, ears trained on the sounds of snow, shifting, wind carrying distant howls or worse, the silence before an attack. He couldn't afford to get sick, couldn't afford to fall. His sheep needed him. His village depended on him. And he only had himself. Frostbite was a daily threat. His fingertips cracked and bled. His nose burned red. His toes ached so fiercely that sometimes he wondered if he could walk at all. But every time he was tempted to sit too long or rest too deep, he remembered his father's words. The frost only takes the still ones. Move, even if you crawl. And so he did. Elric used fire not for comfort, but survival. He kept flames low and steady. Too much heat and the sweat would freeze on him. Too little, and it wouldn't matter. The fire had to live just enough to keep the death away. That winter, the storms didn't stop. The cold didn't ease. But Elric Amos, wrapped in rags and courage, never left his post. Not because he was fearless, but because he had no choice. The wrath of winter demanded everything a shepherd could give, and still asked for more. Elric Amos had no armor. His battlefield was snow-covered pasture land, and his weapons were fire, instinct, and the layers on his back. Clothing wasn't fashion, it was survival. Each garment Elric wore had a purpose, each thread a defense against the creeping death of cold. He began with coarse linen shirts, wrapped in 2s or 3s. Worn tight against the skin, they soaked sweat and shielded from the first bite of frost. Over these he wore a heavy woolen zipon, hand-woven and twice patched, passed down from his father. The wool, scratchy and heavy, carried the scent of smoke and soil, proof of its long service. But the true guardian was sheepskin. He draped a cloak made of inverted fleece over his shoulders, fur side in. Its thickness gave warmth no sunlight could match in winter. Stitched at the seams, greased with resin to resist snow, it clung to him like a second skin. If the wind whipped hard enough, he pulled it over his head and vanished inside its warmth like a bear in a den. His boots were made of old leather, cracked at the seams and lined with dry moss and wool scraps. He changed the lining daily to avoid the wet turning to ice. Inside each boot, he tucked strips of birch bark, his own invention, to trap heat and wick moisture. His hands were covered in rough gloves made from old sheep hide, stitched together by his mother Nala before she fell ill. When the gloves tore, he wrapped strips of cloth around his fingers and tied them with twine. Nothing elegant, just effective. On his head, Elric wore a thick sheepskin cap. On harsher nights, he pulled over a clobicus, a deep hood that wrapped around his neck and shoulders, made from dark wool, blackened with soot and oil. This simple addition made the difference between frostbitten ears and making it to sunrise. He carried a leather pouch on his belt, never for coins but for fire-making. Flint, salves, cloth wraps, and salted roots. Behind his back, a small sack held spare socks, dried meat, and a tightly folded wool blanket. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Nothing Elric wore was beautiful. Every piece was stained, patched, and heavy, but every layer had a purpose. Every buckle, strap, and seam told a story of storms endured, nights survived, and sheep saved. The clothes were handed down, repaired in the field, stitched by firelight. He learned to fix his own tears with curved knives and bone needles. A shepherd couldn't afford to wait for the village tailor. If a boot failed midwinter, it could cost him a toe, or his life. Fur and wool were sacred, not just warmth, but life itself. Elric treated them with reverence. To lose a cloak in a snowstorm was to lose your chance at dawn. And so, before each trek into the white wild, Elric dressed like a soldier going into war. Not for glory, but for survival. When the wind screamed across the hills, and the sheep huddled close, Elric stood firm, not because he was strong, but because he was wrapped in generations of wisdom, stitched into every inch of fabric on his back. When the cold became unbearable and the wind threatened to strip the flesh from bone, Elric Amos had only one option: build a shelter, fast. He had no cabin, no roof, no stable to retreat to. His shelter was whatever the land offered and whatever his hands could build before the dark swallowed the light. Each night it was a different battlefield. Some nights he was lucky. He found a ravine with rock walls that broke the wind. Other nights all he had were twigs, his cloak, and a prayer. Elric learned early. Don't waste time looking for comfort. Build what you can, where you can. He stacked branches and sawed into makeshift tents, leaned bark slabs against tree trunks, and once even slept beneath the belly of an overturned cart half buried in snow. In the forest, he used fallen trees and earth hollows. He'd dig into a snowbank with his hands, line it with twigs and straw, and curl up like an animal. If wolves didn't get you, the cold would. And the only defense was a barrier, even the thinnest one, between skin and sky. When he had time, he built what some called a half-house. He dug a pit just deep enough to block the wind, laid poles over the top, piled spruce branches or hay over it, and pressed stones along the sides to stop the structure from blowing away. It wasn't much, but inside it was 10 degrees warmer, and that was sometimes the difference between frostbite and life. Fire was everything. No matter how tired, Elric never slept without a flame. He built fires low and tight, trapping warmth inside walls of stones and branches, dry bark, bits of resin, a hidden coal wrapped in wool. These were treasures, not just tools. The fire not only warmed his hands and food, it kept wolves at bay and madness at arm's length. He carried a firebrand in a pouch against his chest, close enough that even his body heat could keep it from dampening. Losing it was unthinkable. It was life. When wind howled like banshees across the hills, he buried the flame beneath a frame of green wood and let it smolder, shielding it with his body. When fire failed, he sang old songs into the darkness, not for joy, but to keep himself awake. The silence could be deadly. Sometimes other shepherds would join him. They built shared shelters on known pastures, places locals called herd camps. There, fires burned longer. Guards rotated through the night, and when the cold was sharp enough to cut breath short, even the silence was easier to bear beside another human soul. But most nights, Elric was alone, with only his dog, Bran curled beside him and a knife wrapped in cloth under his cloak. He slept in bursts, 20 minutes at a time, ears tuned to the crack of a twig, the crunch of ice, or the low growl of a beast circling just beyond the firelight. In southern regions, shepherds stayed longer in pastures through winter, building semi-permanent huts. But in the jagged north where Elric wandered, such permanence was a dream. His home was the land, his ceiling the stars, his walls the snow. Even then, he didn't curse the earth. The wild gave him no comfort, but it gave him purpose. Every stick, every stone, every twig and fir scrap became part of his shield. His shelter was not a place of sleep. It was a fortress of instinct, improvised, worn, and blessed by sheer endurance. In the morning, he would rise from the frost, shake the snow from his cloak, and leave nothing behind but smoke and footprints. Because the shepherd always moves forward. In the dead of winter, food wasn't about taste. For Elric Amos, it was about survival, plain and brutal. He didn't feast. He rationed. Every meal was calculated. Every bite had to serve a purpose, to keep his muscles from stiffening, his mind from fogging, and his soul from sinking beneath the weight of cold. He ate not for pleasure, but to stay alive. His daily rations were pitiful. Crumbs of dried rye, bread, strips of salted lamb fat wrapped in cloth, brittle turnip slices hardened from cold, and a few berries dried in the fading autumn sun. He kept them in a leather pouch near his chest, his only pantry. If he was lucky enough to light a fire, he boiled water in a scorched iron bowl or a clay cup. That was the moment he called the saving minute, when heat met hunger. Into the pot, he dropped handfuls of crushed barley or oats, sometimes just stale crumbs of bread, sometimes onion skins or dried mushroom slices. He made what he could. Chowders so thin they barely had color, but warm enough to thaw the chill biting at his ribs. The herbs were his secret weapon. Collected in the warmer months and dried in tight bundles, they were more than flavor. They were survival medicine. Elric brewed infusions of St. John's wort, calamus root, mint, and motherwort. Not because he enjoyed the taste, but because he knew they could fight colds, warm the blood, and stave off fever. These weren't drinks. They were defenses. He'd sip slowly, cradling the hot bowl in both hands, letting the steam rise into his cracked face. Even one swallow could make the cold retreat, just enough to think clearly, to act fast if the sheep stirred or the wind shifted. Meat was rare. When it appeared, it was often tragic. A lamb that froze, a bird caught in a trap. Once he roasted a hedgehog whole on the coals, his stomach too empty to consider disgust. The flavor didn't matter. Warmth did. On hard nights, he mixed snow with grits and thawed porridge he'd frozen days before. In cruel years, he crushed pine needles into tea or ground bark into mash with old bran. These meals left a bitter aftertaste, but they brought enough strength to stand. He carried salt in a leather pouch, not just for flavor, but for preservation and spirit. Salt kept meat from rotting. It also reminded him he was still alive, still able to taste. And in that world, sensation was proof of survival. Once a season, if he passed through a village or a hunter's cabin, he might receive a sip of mead or homemade kvass, often stored in clay jugs wrapped in wool to stop it from freezing. Just one sip could light his chest like a fire. But he used it sparingly. Too much, and he knew. The frost would kill a drunk faster than a sober man. His dogs shared in the same meals. Dried bone, a sliver of meat, hot broth poured into a shallow wooden bowl, because if the dogs failed, he would, have no warning, no guard, no warmth beside him. In a blizzard, even a dog's heartbeat could be the difference between survival and death. Every meal was a ritual, not sacred, but precise, efficient, passed down through generations. It was never wasteful, never more than needed, and always, always meant to give him just enough strength to face the next hour. For Elric, food wasn't comfort, it was fuel. And in a world of snow, silence, and shadows, fuel was all a shepherd had. Night was when the real war began. By day, Elric Amos walked. He watched. He endured. But when the sun vanished behind the hills and the last color drained from the sky, the cold took on a new form, one that didn't just freeze the body. It hunted the spirit. In the dark, the frost whispered lies. It told him to rest a little longer, close his eyes, just a few more minutes. But Elric had heard that voice before, and he knew it well. It was death, cloaked in comfort. So he fought it, not with swords or shouting, but with motion. He paced around the fire in tight circles. He stomped his feet until his soles burned. He slapped his arms against his sides and rubbed his hands hard, trying to keep the blood moving. He wasn't dancing. He was surviving. The key was movement without exhaustion. If he moved too much, he'd sweat. And sweat was a killer. Wet clothes turned to ice. So Elric learned rhythm, just enough effort to warm his limbs, never enough to drench them. He never slept for long, just short bursts, 20 minutes at most. Always near the fire, always sitting upright, knees to chest, wrapped in a sheepskin, like a cocoon. He placed a hot stone, warmed by flame, against his lower back to trick his body into thinking it was safe. It wasn't. Beside him, his dog Bran dozed with one eye open. The beast knew the routine. Any sudden rustle in the trees, and Bran would growl low in his throat, dragging Elric back to consciousness. On nights when the air was cruel, when the wind screamed and even the fire shrank, Elric stuffed dry straw or moss inside his cloak, between his shirt layers. Anywhere insulation could matter. If there was a lamb or pup small enough, he curled against it. Living warmth was worth more than gold. Some nights, he rubbed animal fat onto his chest, shoulders, and sides, an ancient trick his father once whispered while mending boots by firelight. The wind hates grease, Braxton Amos had said. It slides right off. If the cold pulled too deeply at his bones, Elric chewed a pinch of salt, bit into raw onion, or even licked black pepper root. The sting shocked his system awake. The pain was a gift. It reminded him he was still alive. And then there were the sounds. When silence stretched too long, Elric would hum, just soft enough to feel his chest vibrate. Sometimes he sang old verses his mother had taught him, not for joy, but for rhythm, for sanity. A quiet voice meant a warm heart. And as the elder said, a tongue that moves means death's still waiting. There were moments, huddled beneath a frozen sky, where his hands shook uncontrollably, his breath came in clouds, and the fire faded into ember. That's when fear tried hardest to creep in. But Elric had learned, the cold only wins when your mind gives up first. So he didn't let it. He stirred the coals. He whispered to Bran. He reached into his pouch, felt the rough salt, the flint, stone, the string of dried herbs, proof that he was still prepared, that he wasn't done yet, because in the shepherd's world, night wasn't rest. It was survival in its purest form. And Elric Amos, wrapped in firelight and frost, kept standing, kept moving, kept breathing, because if he made it to dawn, he'd live to guard the flock another day. The night held terrors that were as real as the biting cold. Beyond the white expanse and flickering firelight, dangers lurked, not only in the shape of wild beasts, but also in human shadows. Elric Amos knew every sound carried a warning. In the darkness, the snarls of wolves were not mere echoes. They were living threats, prowling the periphery of his makeshift camp. Their eyes glimmered in the half-light, hunting instinctively for any lapse in his vigilance. Even when his heart pounded in his chest, Elric's eyes darted through the gloom, searching for the subtle shift of a tail or the slightest rustle in the undergrowth. But animals were not his only adversaries. In the lonely, unforgiving wild, dangerous men sometimes roamed. Desperate bandits, outcasts with nothing to lose, or deserters who embraced the cold to hide their sins. These human predators, cloaked by the night, could swoop in silently to steal a sheep or strike a lone shepherd when he was most vulnerable. Elric armed himself accordingly. His crooked staff, a humble tool by day, transformed into a stout weapon when darkness brought threats. At his side lay a small knife, its blade wrapped in cloth to avoid frost, always ready as a last resort against both beast and man. His faithful dog Bran, ever alert, became a living alarm, barking at even the faintest disturbance. Bran's low growl at the rustle of leaves or the distant clink of metal meant danger was imminent. To defend his flock, Elric resorted to ancient methods. He set crude traps around his temporary shelter, sharpened stakes, burning coals scattered in strategic patterns and makeshift barriers fashioned from logs and stones. Smoke, too, had its part in his defense. A well-placed bundle of juniper and garlic on the fire emitted a pungent odor that was thought to keep both animal and human predators at bay. Every sound in the night was scrutinized. A sudden snap of a twig might announce the approach of a wolf or a stealthy intruder. Every shadow was a potential threat. He paced the camp frequently, his eyes keen in the darkness, ensuring that no silent figure could get too close without his notice. In those long, perilous hours, fear danced hand in hand with duty. There were moments when the terror of an unseen assailant, a beast emerging from the forest or a man crouched behind a snowy ridge, made his heart race uncontrollably. But Elric's resolve was forged in countless winters. Survival demanded a balance between caution and boldness, between trust in his instincts and trust in the loyalty of those who shared his vigil. Night after night, amidst the howl of wind and the whispered threats of danger, the solitary shepherd fought to keep his flock safe. He was a guardian in a realm where frost and ferocity intertwined, a sentinel armed with nothing but a staff, a blade, and a stubborn will to survive. For every night survived was a testament to his unyielding spirit, a story not just of overcoming the cold, but of confronting the peril that crept in when the world turned dark. When the fire faded low and even the dog lay silent, Elric Amos turned to what couldn't be touched: faith. In the merciless void of night, when the cold whispered madness and shadows stretched like claws, he reached beyond the physical. His strength came not only from fire or food, but from belief. And in that world, belief was not an ornament. It was armor. Around his neck hung a wooden cross, carved by his father. Braxton from a fallen birch tree. Elric never took it off. It had been blessed at the tiny chapel in Stonehaven and anointed with ash and oil during the last harvest festival. He didn't wear it for decoration. He wore it for protection against the unknown, the unseen, and the unthinkable. Before sleep, if it ever came, Elric whispered prayers, sometimes from memory, sometimes barely audible, a line from the Lord's Prayer, a plea to St. Nicholas, protector of travelers, a simple murmur, "Watch over me and my flock." But not all of Elric's protection came from the church. In the silence between stars, he practiced older rituals, those handed down not in books, but around fires, by grandmothers and shepherds who walked the earth before him. He tucked red thread through his sheep's wool to ward off the evil eye. He burned juniper sprigs in his fire, believing the smoke would drive out malevolent spirits. He sang old carol songs on the coldest nights, not for festivity, but to keep loneliness and fear at bay. He didn't question these traditions. He honored them. Because in a world where wolves had eyes and snow had teeth, nothing was too small to matter. Some things, faith among them, were bigger than reason. In his camp, at the edge of the woods, Elric often stuck willow twigs upright in the ground, forming a square perimeter. His mother, Nala, had once told him that frost couldn't cross a sacred shape. On nights when the cold pressed against his skin like glass, he believed it. He also kept small items tucked in his pouch, dried lavender for calm, a coin blessed by the village priest, and a raven's feather said to bring sharp sight in the dark. These weren't luxuries. They were tokens of survival, reminders that the battle wasn't only physical, it was spiritual. And when storms howled like demons and his hand shook too much to light the fire, he whispered a phrase his father once said in a hoarse voice during their last winter together. "If you can't see the fire, say its name. If you can't feel your breath, speak it back." And so he did, because in the middle of the wild, where even the dogs shivered and the trees groaned under ice, belief was a flame inside the chest, a warmth that didn't need wood or spark, a shield no frost could break. And for Elric Amos, that flame often meant the difference between another dawn and never waking up at all. Among the hills of Stonehaven and beyond, tales of shepherds who survived the impossible passed from fire pit to fire pit. And in time, Elric Amos's own endurance would become part of that sacred whispering. These weren't stories of warriors or kings. They were about boys with cracked hands, frozen beards, and eyes that refused to close, men who faced nature and did not bow. There was the tale of Jareth Quinn, a shepherd who got caught in a blizzard while crossing the ice of the Greybend River. Cut off from his camp, snow to his waist, he dug a hole into a drift, wrapped himself in sheepskins, and stayed there for 3 days with nothing but his dogs and a burning ember cradled in a tin cup. They say he emerged with blackened fingers but a flock untouched. Another spoke of Maeve Turner, a girl no older than 16, who guided her flock into a deep ravine when a storm rolled in. She built 5 small fires in a ring, placed stones, warmed by flame around the sheep, and curled herself in the center. She had learned the trick from her grandmother. Fire is not to be big, only to be clever. She lived. So did every animal. Elric heard these stories growing up, whispered by old men with missing toes and women who had outlived every winter. They weren't told to impress. They were passed down to prepare. One tale hit hardest. In The Suzel Thief records, a man named Seaman survived a blizzard by wrapping himself in the hides of sheep that had frozen to death. He buried himself beside their bodies, using their warmth to shield his own. It was a horror, but a necessity. Survival has no pride. These weren't myths, they were blueprints. The monks at the edge of Stonehaven kept their own accounts of men who lost fingers, feet, entire flocks, but returned with enough to save the village. Some stories turned into proverbs. Frost spares the shepherd who remembers the wind. He who sleeps without fire dreams no more. A sharp blade delays death, but warm breath defies it. And now Elric Amos, young, quiet, and tireless, was building a story of his own. There was the night he crossed a frozen plain with wolves howling in the dark. The wind turned, and the smoke from his fire vanished. The cold was so sharp it peeled the skin from his knuckles. But Elric didn't run. He walked backward, dragging burning twigs to create a trail of light, confusing the predators behind him. It worked, or the time he saved a dying lamb by tucking it into his own cloak and wrapping both of them in his sheepskin under a collapsed willow. He fed it warm broth made from water, crushed oats, and dried herbs, sipped it first, then dripped it into its mouth. The lamb lived, so did he. He never spoke of these things, but the others saw. And when the young ones joined the fields, when new hands trembled lighting their first fire, they whispered, "Do what Elric does. Watch the wind. Don't sleep too long. Wrap the stones." He had become what he once listened to, a living story, because legends weren't written in books. They were carved into frozen footprints, into the cracked leather of boots, into the calloused hands of boys who didn't die when the snow tried to claim them. Centuries have passed since Elric Amos walked the frozen hills of Stonehaven with firewood in one hand and duty in the other. The world has changed. Electricity hums in every home, weather warnings come with a single click, and warm meals arrive with a knock on the door. But if you listen carefully, beyond the static, beyond the noise, you'll hear a truth the shepherds always knew. Survival isn't technology, it's instinct, it's preparation, it's grit. Elric didn't know the word resilience. He lived it. He couldn't Google how to build a shelter in a snowstorm. He shaped it with his hands. He didn't own thermal gear or GPS or emergency radios. His tools were simpler: dry moss, a flicker of flame, an ear tuned to wind, a whisper of faith, and the ability to keep moving when everything begged him to stop. And that's what makes the lessons of shepherds like Elric more relevant now than ever. In a world growing dependent on comfort and convenience, the shepherd's life reminds us how much we've forgotten and how much we still need to remember. How to build from nothing, how to read the signs in the sky, how to stay calm when everything around you is chaos, how to protect what matters, even if no one sees you doing it. Elric's story is a reminder that true survival isn't about overpowering nature, it's about respecting it, working with it, moving like it, enduring it without becoming something less. Modern survivalists, preppers, and adventurers now study what men like Elric once did by instinct. They dig pits for warmth, they wrap hot stones in cloth, they boil pine needles for vitamins, they layer natural fabrics to conserve heat. Every tactic, every tradition, they echo a shepherd's wisdom. But Elric didn't call it survival, he called it life. And in that life, he carried something technology could never replace: a deep awareness of self, of surroundings, of silence. He knew when the wind would turn before it blew. He knew when to ration food without needing a spreadsheet. He could find fire in ash, comfort in prayer, and purpose in suffering. That's the kind of strength we forget until it's needed. So when your power fails, when the road vanishes, when comfort crumbles, remember Elric Amos, the boy who lit a fire in the snow, who listened to the trees, who moved when others froze, because he left no statues, no scrolls, only footsteps in frost, and lessons strong enough to outlive the ice. Long after the snows of Stonehaven melted and the shepherds vanished from the hills, the land remembers. The wind still sings through the trees where boys like Elric Amos once stood guard against the cold, and the fire pits, now buried beneath earth and moss, once kept the silence from claiming a soul. Elric's story was never written down in fine ink or carved into stone, but it lived in the way his people survived, in the way they built fires low, in the way they listened to the wind and trusted the bark on trees to point them north, in the way they kept moving when sleep beckoned like death in disguise. Because Elric Amos wasn't a hero in the grand sense. He didn't conquer kingdoms, he didn't slay dragons, but every night he stayed awake to keep his flock safe. Every time he lit a flame when his fingers were stiff with frost. Every step he took across fields where no footprints remained. That was heroism. Quiet, relentless, real. He was the link between man and wilderness, between life and loss, between the strength of the body and the stubbornness of spirit. He lived where nature ruled, where no one watched, and where every mistake had a cost measured in lives. And that's why his kind mattered. They were guardians without titles, watchers without praise. Men and women who knew that survival is not a shout. It's a whisper carried through wind and time. Elric taught us that resilience is built from silence, that wisdom doesn't come from books but from listening, truly listening, to the earth. That survival isn't domination, it's harmony, it's respect, it's sacrifice. Today, in a world that often forgets its roots, his footsteps still matter. So when modern comforts fail, when you find yourself without direction, stripped of control, standing alone beneath a starless sky, light a fire. Wrap yourself in what you have. Breathe steady, and remember Elric Amos, the shepherd who stood between the cold and everything that mattered, because his strength wasn't in his arms, it was in his will, and that kind of strength never dies.